A good day, everyone. Another topic to be discussed is the physiology and how the muscle usually contracts and relaxes. So for today, I will be discussing kung paano nagko-contract and nare-relax yung muscle natin. So this is the process of muscle contraction. So um, let's define what is muscle contraction. So it says here that is the tightening, shortening, or lengthening of muscles when the animal usually moves. So usually yung initiation ng muscle contraction, um, always take note that there should be a signal initiation. Okay? So walang mangyayari na muscle contraction without an initiation from the sensory neurons. So yung process ng muscle contraction, it usually begins with a conscious decision or intention na mag-move yung isang specific muscle or group of muscles. Okay? So yung decision na to usually originates doon sa motor cortex ng brain wherein yung mga signals are usually generated. Okay? So once the decision to move a muscle is usually being made, yung mga motor neurons in the somatic nervous system, they are now responsible in transmitting those signals from the central nervous system. Okay? So parang kung titignan natin yung muscle contraction, it's a combined effort of the central nervous system as well as the somatic nervous system. Okay? In terms of the transmission now of signals from the central nervous system, primarily yung brain or as reflex activity of the spinal cord, eto siya, into the target muscle na siya. Okay? So that is number one, before na merong muscle contraction. Now, there are several steps that usually being done before na merong muscle contraction. So number one dyan is depolarization and calcium ion release. So eto na siya is um, if the nervous system, okay, when the nervous system signals a muscle to contract, yung action potential or yung electrical signal, it will travel down the motor neuron to the neuromuscular junction. I will try to show it to you later on kung ano yung neuromuscular junction. So, dito kasi in terms of the depolarization, doon sa neuromuscular junction, yung motor neuron, it will release now the acetylcholine, which is the neurotransmitter, para makapag-bind siya sa receptor doon sa sarcolemma. Okay? So yung binding, it will cause now the depolarization of the sarcolemma and yung propagation na ng action potential along the sarcolemma. Okay? So yung action potential, it will travel down into the muscle cell via the transverse tubules or yung tinatawag natin na T-tubules, and then it will trigger the release of the calcium ions from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay? So I will have a more comprehensive discussion in the next coming slides. Okay? And then another one, we have actin and myosin crossbridge formation. So para ang mangyayari lang dito is if yung na-release na calcium ions from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it will bind now to troponin. Okay? That is usually yung protein na associated doon sa mga thin filaments doon sa sarcomere. So, yung binding, yung pag-bind ng troponin tsaka yung calcium ions, it will cause a conformational change doon sa troponin. So, if that's the case, okay, merong conformation, okay, merong change doon, it will expose now the binding sites and actin for myosin heads. Okay? I will have more deeper dyan. And then next one, meron tayong sliding mechanism, and then pag meron ng shortening ng sarcomere, if the sarcomere usually shortens now, kasi naghilahan na yung actin tsaka yung myosin, then that is now a muscle contraction. Okay? So let's have one by one the process. Number one is depolarization and calcium ion release. So as what I have said, yung muscle contraction, um, it usually begins with the arrival of an action potential, which is the electrical signal at the dito siya, at the neuromuscular junction. Okay? So yung action potential that is generated in the central nervous system and somatic nervous system, and it will travel along the motor neuron to the motor end plate, which is now, this is the region, etong motor end plate, this is the region where the motor neuron will make a contact with the muscle fiber. This is the muscle fiber already. Okay? So when the action potential now reaches, no, it reaches now the terminal end of the motor neuron, yung motor end plate, it will trigger now the release of the neurotransmitter, which is the acetylcholine doon sa synaptic cleft, which is yun yung small gap between the motor neuron and the muscle fiber. Okay? So once na na-release yung acetylcholine, it will bind now to the sarcolemma. Okay? Yung sarcolemma, that is the cell membrane of the muscle at the motor end plate. Okay? So yung binding nito, yung binding ng acetylcholine, tsaka yung receptors ng sarcolemma, it will result now in the depolarization of the sarcolemma, causing now a change doon sa electrical charge. Okay? So yung depolarization signal usually rapidly na propagated throughout the entire muscle fiber via the transverse tubules or yung T-tubules natin. Okay? So etong mga to is etong mga T-tubules na to, they are usually the invaginations of the sarcolemma that usually extend deeper into the muscle fibers. So etong mga T-tubules, sila yung tumutulong na mag-transmit ng electrical signal into the interior part of the muscle fiber para ma-allow yung coordination ng contraction ng buong muscle. Okay? So after that one, yung depolarization ng sarcolemma, it will cause now a major impact on the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay, as what I have said, that is a specialized organelle within the muscle cell. So yung, as what I've said from my previous discussion, si sarcoplasmic reticulum, siya yung nag-i-store ng calcium ions at a lower level when the muscle is usually at rest. Pero siya din yung nag-i-store and nagre-release if there is a muscle contraction. Okay? So, yung depolarization now ng sarcolemma, it will trigger the opening now of the calcium ion release and the channels and the sarcoplasmic reticulum membrane. So yung opening na to, it will allow for the release of the stored calcium from the lumen part into the cytoplasm of the muscle fiber with the aid, of course, of the protein calciquestrine. Okay? So, in terms of calcium storage kasi, si protein na calciquestrine, meron siyang mataas na binding affinity doon sa mga calcium ions. So parang siya yung nag-a-act as a calcium buffer by binding and sequestering the calcium ions within the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay? So in terms of muscle contraction now, yung release nito, no? Yung release ng stored calcium ions doon sa during yung excitation contraction coupling ng mga muscle cells, yung protein na calciquestrine, siya yung nag-act as a key regulator sa process na to. Okay? So when the muscle is stimulated, yung sarcoplasmic reticulum, it will release the stored calcium, which then binds to the proteins in the contractile units of the muscle, which now facilitate yung mismong muscle contraction. So after muscle contraction, yung calciquestrin din na protein, siya din yung tumutulong na mag-resequester yung calcium ions back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Kaya parang mapapumped back, as what I've said noon sa previous discussion ko, mapapumped back yung mismong mga calcium ions. And that is because of the aid of the protein calciquestrin. Okay? So meron tayo dito, sabi dito, calcium ions play a pivotal role in initiating muscular contraction. So, mas maintindihan niyo dito. So, parang dito sa process na to is with the aid of the acetylcholine and with the aid of the calciquestrin na produce or na-release yung calcium ions. Now, ang question, saan papunta na ngayon yung mga calcium ions na na-release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum? And that is now, we have here the actin and myosin crossbridge formation. Okay? So, as part now of the depolarization and calcium ion release process, yung mga calcium ions, they are released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and then they will bind sa troponin. Okay? They will bind now sa troponin, which is a component ng troponin-tropomyosin na complex. No? So, if the calcium ions binds with the protonin or the troponin, they will now cause a conformational change in the troponin-tropomyosin complex. Okay? So yung conformational change ngayon, it will shift the position of the tropomyosin, which now exposes etong binding site. And we call this one as the myosin binding sites and the actin filaments. Okay? Kasi once kung makikita niyo ito si troponin, tapos nag-join si calcium ion dito, nakipag-bind si calcium ion dito, mare-reverse to, machi-change to, mako-conformational change to. And it will now expose, once na na-reverse ito, merong conformational change, etong part na to, yung tropomyosin, eto na siya, magkakaroon na siya ng binding site. Okay? Kasi nag-conformational change, ang na-expose is the binding site. And we call that one as the myosin binding sites. Okay? So, with the myosin binding sites and the actin filament are now exposed, no? Since na-expose na to, merong mga myosin heads and the thick filaments that are usually free na makipag-bind sa mga sites na to. Okay? So yung mga myosin binding, yung mga myosin heads now will attach to the exposed binding sites and actin, forming now a cross bridge. Doon magkakaroon ng cross bridge formation. Pag yung myosin heads nakipag-attach doon sa exposed na binding sites, that is now meron nang na-form na cross bridge formation. Okay? So papaano ba to? In terms of the myosin heads kasi, they will form the cross bridges or yung tinatawag natin na power stroke. Okay? Forming the cross bridges, the pivot or the power stroke, yung pivoting motion or yung power stroke, it will pull the thin filament toward the center of the sarcomere. Okay? So yung sliding motion ngayon ng actin will pass from the myosin filaments, it shortens the sarcomere, leading now to muscle contraction. Okay? So meron na tayo dito in terms of the ATP binds to the myosin head, breaking the cross bridge between actin and myosin. So as the muscle contracts now, yung ATP binds to the myosin heads, which are usually part of the thick filaments. Yung ATP binding, it will allow the myosin heads now to detach from the actin binding sites and the thin filament. So after detachment, merong hydrolysis ng ATP. Okay? So yung ATP, before na merong contraction, there should be a hydrolysis of ATP. Dapat si ATP magiging ADP siya and phosphate group or phosphate molecule, I should say. So that is ADP and then yung mga inorganic na phosphate or the PI, that is now. So yung hydrolysis ngayon ng ATP, it will provide the energy necessary for the myosin heads na mag-change position and mag-swivel. Okay? So yung energy from ATP hydrolysis, it will causes now the myosin heads to reorient themselves and move towards the next available binding site doon sa actin. So etong repositioning na to, it usually sometimes referred as what I've said kanina as the power stroke. Okay? Now, papaano yung sliding mechanism in terms of this one? So yung mga myosin heads that are attached, no, that are attached to the actin, they will exert a force as they swivel or as they pivot. No? So parang eto siya in terms of the myosin heads. And then, yung motion na to, it will slide doon sa thin filaments along the thick filaments toward the center of the sarcomere. So yung theory ngayon ng sliding filament theory is that yung myosin heads, they will walk along the actin filaments, causing them to slide past each other. So yung sliding ngayon ng actin and saka yung myosin filaments is the fundamental mechanism of muscle contraction. Kasi as sarcomeres, the basic contractile units of muscle shorten, the entire muscle usually contracts. Okay? Okay, and then meron din tayo dito, the myosin heads move the actin filaments in a similar fashion to the way in which an oar propels a rowboat. Ano ba yung analogy natin in terms of rowing? Comparing now the movement to the way an oar propels a rowboat, parang in a similar fashion, yung myosin heads, they usually function as the oar. Okay? Propelling now the actin filaments in a controlled and coordinated manner to generate the muscle contraction. Now, as previously described or discussed, yung sliding mechanism ng actin and myosin filaments involves now the repeated reorientation of myosin heads, which results from the energy derived from ATP hydrolysis. Now, yung myosin heads, no, yung myosin heads after reorientation, they will attach to new binding sites and the actin filaments. So when they pivot or when they swivel, they will pull or drag now the actin filaments along the length of the myosin. Okay? So yung mga actin filaments, they are usually anchored to Z lines or yung mga or they are anchored at the both ends of the ZDs, okay, which now mark the boundaries of the sarcomere. So, as what I've said noon, si ZDs or the Z lines, they usually help in maintaining the structural integrity and alignment of the sarcomere. Okay? So, as the myosin heads now will pull the actin filaments, yung mga ZDs natin, they will under either the side of the sarcomere, which are usually drawn closer together. So yung movement na to of the ZDs will occur within the sarcomere. Napapaano to in terms of the sarcomere shortening, usually, in terms of this one, as what I've said, if there is yung muscle contraction, pag meron ng shortening, that is because yung muscle contraction, that is a result of the shortening of individual sarcomeres. Okay? So which now occur in a repeated cycle ng crossbridge formation and the sliding mechanism of actin and myosin filaments. So that is now the end of muscle contraction. So let's have a summary of the muscle contraction. So as what I've said kanina, an action potential doon sa motor neuron, it will trigger the release of calcium ions from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So the calcium ions now will bind the troponin and the actin filaments, leading now to the repositioning of the tropomyosin, which now exposes the binding sites for myosin heads and actin filaments, or the myosin binding sites. Now, the actin and myosin heads will form a cross bridge. Okay, so this binding is usually broken by the ATP hydrolysis. So yung ATP that is hydrolyzed, and then it will become adenosine diphosphate and then the inorganic phosphate molecules. So after ATP is hydrolyzed, it will provide energy for the myosin heads to change their orientation or to swivel. Okay? So yung mga swiveled na myosin heads, they will bind to new binding sites and actin before returning to their original conformation. So, sabi dito, yung output from the hydrolysis ng ATP, yung ADP, and yung mga inorganic phosphate molecules, they are released during this step. Okay? And then after that one, the repositioning of the myosin heads moves the actin filament toward the center of the sarcomere. So the sliding now of actin along the myosin, it will shorten this sarcomere, leading now to muscle contraction. Okay? So meron din tayo dito, sabi dito, the process of turning off the muscle contraction is being done by the following sequence of events. So number one dyan is the acetylcholine breakdown. So yung acetylcholine, which was released at the neuromuscular junction to initiate the action potential, that is broken down by the enzyme acetylcholinesterase. Okay? So yung enzymatic breakdown na to, it will rapidly terminate the action potentials along the sarcolemma, which is the muscle cell membrane. So with the cessation now of the action potential, so mababa na yung level ng action potential, yung sarcoplasmic reticulum, ano na din, magsisist na din siya sa pag-release ng mga calcium ions. So instead, it begins the process of resequestering or the actively pumping back. So all the calcium ions that were released during muscle contraction, they will be pumped back. Okay? And that is what we call as resequestering. Okay? So in the absence now of the calcium ions, there is a change in the configuration of troponin and tropomyosin. So the proteins that are usually associated ito sa actin filament. So yung troponin tropomyosin complexes regain their original positions, blocking now again the active binding sites doon sa actin. So this will prevent now the myosin heads from attaching it to actin and forming cross bridges. So as a result of the reconfiguration of the troponin tropomyosin complex and the absence of the calcium ions, the muscle contraction usually ceases. Okay? So in the living animal, the length of the muscle is passively restored to its original state by external forces. Like for example, yung gravity or antagonistic muscles. Okay? Yung mga antagonistic muscles, they are usually yung mga muscles that have the opposite function to the contracting muscle. So for example, when the if yung biceps muscle will contract to flex yung forearm, yung mga triceps muscle, which is the antagonist, it will relax and allow the forearm to return to its extended position. Although I will discuss yung mga functional groupings ng mga muscles for the next discussion. Okay? So I hope that you have understood well what is muscle contractions, paano na i-initiate yung muscle contraction, and how the muscle contraction ceases. Okay? So thank you very much for listening.